Hi everyone, PV here, and welcome to my new YouTube video. In today's video, we're going to talk about how to evaluate new cards. In Magic, they release a new set every 2 or 3 months, sometimes even more frequently than that nowadays, which means that every 2 or 3 months, there's an influx of 200 or 300 new cards that have the ability to change whatever format you're playing. Most of these cards are not going to be good. They're just, limited-based cards that are not going to change any format. But some of these cards will change formats, they will create new decks, they will change existing decks. And the goal of today's video is to be able to identify as quickly as possible which cards are going to be the good ones. So which cards are going to be the chase cards from the new sets, which cards are going to spawn new archetypes, and which cards are going to change existing archetypes. But before we start, I want to apologize for being absent this past 2 weeks. I was dealing with some personal stuff, but the goal of the channel is still to do 1 video a week. So nothing in the channel is changing, it was just something that I had to deal with. And I also want to remind you that I do personalized coaching. So if you're interested in one-on-one coaching sessions with me, just message me on Twitter at PVDDR, and I will explain a little bit more how they work. But the gist of it is that it's very flexible and we can focus on whatever you want. So if you have a tournament coming up and you don't know what to play, what the metagame is going to look like, we can talk about that. If you already know what you're playing, we can talk about your deck. We can play some matches. And then, you'll play on ladder. I'll watch the games and talk about the lines of play, the concepts that are interesting, what I would have done in these spots. We can focus on a specific concept, for example, sideboarding or mulliganing. So we can do a lot of different things. It's very flexible. So just message me on Twitter if you're interested at PVDDR, and I'm sure we can work something out. So, new cards. Most of the time when a new card is good and noteworthy, it is because of one of 3 reasons. The first reason is that it's powerful and unique and creates an archetype that didn't exist before. So it's a flagship card for a new archetype. The second reason is that it's part of the theme of the set. And the third reason is that it improves an existing deck in some way. The first type of card is definitely the most exciting, and is the one that I look for the most when I'm analyzing a new set. So the previews come out, I'm specifically looking for cards that are linchpins to a new strategy, because you get really paid off by being the first person to arrive at that. So if something is totally broken and new, you want to be the first person finding it. And how do you find these new broken cards? Well, a lot of the time they have some characteristics in common with other broken cards. There are certain abilities or certain, keywords in Magic that should be noteworthy to you. For example, anything that cheats on mana is potentially very strong. It doesn't mean that anything that cheats on mana is going to be strong. Just means that you should pay particular attention to anything that cheats on mana because it can be strong. For example, Fires of Invention. Fires of Invention was a card that I looked at this card in the spoiler and I was like, well, this card is potentially broken. I don't know what this deck looks like. I have no idea what the best Fires of Invention deck is, but I'm looking at this card. It has the potential to triple your mana every turn of the game. So that's something that's potentially broken. Maybe the card ends up being bad. It didn't, right? It ended up being very good. And that was something that I identified very quickly because it had all the characteristics of a dangerous card. Stuff that, takes extra turns is potentially very dangerous. Stuff that can be played from the graveyard is potentially very dangerous because you don't have to draw it. Stuff that draws a lot of cards at once, especially if it's cheap. This type of card is usually noteworthy. Another example of something that can be very good is cards that present a threat, but also let you react to something in the same turn. So, Teferi, Hero of Dominaria is a card that is extremely good. Nissa, which takes the world, is very good for the same reason. Goldspan Dragon is very good for the same reason. So all of these cards, they do that while also doing something else broken, right? Goldspan Dragon and Nissa add a lot of mana, which is, again, something noteworthy. And Teferi draws a lot of cards, which is also something noteworthy. So once you start seeing those patterns, it's easy to identify which cards can be very good or not. And there are a couple cards like that in the new set, in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. For example, Demilich. Right, Demilich is a card that has 3 different things that should send warning bells to you. The first one is that it can be played for free, right? That's the first red flag. The second one is it casts spells from your graveyard, second red flag. And then it can recast itself from the graveyard, third red flag. So it's a super powerful card in the sense that it's doing a lot of very broken things. Is that going to be good enough? I don't know. But I'm eager to find out because it has the potential to be very good. Another card that is potentially very good, Ebon Death Dracolich. right? It just comes back from the graveyard over and over and over. That's a super powerful effect. Flame School, also a card that can come back from the graveyard over and over and over. Also potentially very powerful. The Book of Exalted Deeds. It says you can't lose the game on it, right? That's such a powerful line of text that it's worth examining to see if it's good. So this type of card should be sending red flags to you, and you should look at them closely whenever you can. And the best way to find out if these noteworthy cards are good or not is to push them to the maximum as soon as you can. So the best way is to build your deck with the assumption that these cards are broken. You want to, make them as good as you can, and then you see if it's worth doing that or not. For example, with Demi-Leech, right? I've seen some people being like, well, Demi-Leech is probably a 1 or 2 off in Izzet Phoenix and Historic, right? Maybe that's true, but I'm going to start with 4. Right? I'm going to play 4 Demi-Leech, and I'm going to play a lot of cards to support. I'm going to play more cheap spells. I'm going to play, a lot of Finale of Promise to play multiple spells in the same turn, because I want to push this card to the maximum. I want to see if, assuming my deck is built to support Demi-Leech, is Demi-Leech good enough? Right? And I'm going to do the same with Book of Exalted Deeds. I'm going to play a bunch of lightning stuff, and I'm going to play Faceless Haven to try to, make sure that my opponents can't win the game. If I have Ebon Death, I'm going to have, self-milling synergies and sacrifice synergies and ways to discard cards. So I'm going to try to push these cards to be as good as they possibly can. And maybe, in the end, I find out that, Demi-Leech isn't good as a 4-off, right? Maybe people are correct. It is a 1-off. That's something that, it's more likely than not, I think, that it's a 1 or 2 off than that it is a 4-off at this point. But I still want to try 4 because I want to see how good it is. So you should do that. As soon as you can, you should just play a bunch of copies of the potentially broken card, and you should support it as much as you can. Then you'll know if it's truly broken or not. If one of these potentially broken cards doesn't pan out, it also doesn't mean that you should forget about it, because there's still the potential for it to be broken if something changes in the future, either the near future or, the far future. And you shouldn't forget about this card. One example is Emergent Ultimatum. Right? When it was released, Emergent Ultimatum should have sent warning bells because it's a potentially broken effect where you get to choose 2 spells and play them for free. That screams broken. But then it turns out that the card just wasn't very good. There wasn't that much to search for. The mana wasn't that great. You want it to be in different colors, not this colors. So the card didn't make any waves the first time around, but someone remembered the card. Someone didn't forget about it. So when they released Valky, Auron's Epiphany, Binding the Old Gods, that meant that you all of a sudden you had a great pile that usually won the game, and you had better fixing, and you had more reasons to be in those colors. So the card realized its broken potential. So if you just forgot about it because it wasn't good when it came out, you would have missed the new development, right? So once a card is potentially broken, unless you just test it and you see, this card is actually much worse than I thought, you should keep it in mind. You shouldn't forget about it completely. Another example is one card that ended up being one of the most powerful cards in Magic, but wasn't good the first time around, and that is Jace the Mind Sculptor. And when Jace the Mind Sculptor came out, everyone thought that it was potentially very good, right? It looks broken, but it wasn't played very much in its first big tournament. That was PT San Diego. And why wasn't it played very much? Because the most played card in the format was Bloodbraid Elf. And Bloodbraid Elf matches up particularly well versus Jace, right? Because it just comes down and attacks it and kills it, and it can't really be bounced profitably. So the fact that Bloodbraid Elf decks were the best decks meant that Jace had to be set aside. But it didn't mean the card was bad. The card is broken, right? It was one of the best cards in Magic, but it wasn't good for that format. So people set it aside and started playing it again once the format changed. But no one forgot about Jace. You had to know that it was still potentially very broken. Another example, Ancestral Vision, right? Ancestral Vision is a card that is super strong. It sees play in a lot of different formats, but almost no one played it when it came out. And that wasn't because people were stupid. It wasn't because the pro players couldn't look at this card and identify that it was strong. It was because Remand was one of the most played cards in the format, and Remand is super hostile to Ancestral Vision itself. So people set it aside, and then once Remand rotated out, Ancestral Vision became one of the defining cards of the format. So whenever you have a situation where a card looks broken, or is potentially broken, but it doesn't pan out, and the deck isn't good, it pays off to understand why that was the case. Is it because the card is not actually as good as you thought it was? That's certainly a possibility, right? Is it because the support isn't there for it yet, like the Emergent Ultimatum? Or is it because the format is particularly hostile to it right now, right? Because, if the reason is that it's just bad, then you don't worry about it. But if the reason is that there's no support yet, then you pay particular attention to every new card that comes up, right, in future sets, and whether you can support this card or not. And if it's because the format is hostile, you pay particular attention to the changes in the format, right? It doesn't have to be that the card rotated out, right? Maybe there is a development that makes Remand unplayable. maybe there's a new card, or maybe now blue is bad, right? I guess blue is bad would make a Saturation bad too. But you get the idea, right? It doesn't have to be, Blood Red Elf rotated out. But maybe no one's playing Blood Red Elf anymore for whatever reason, and then Jace is good all of a sudden, right? So you have to understand why this potentially broken card is not actually broken right now. Is it because it's bad, because there's no support, or because it's being hated, right? And once you understand why it's not actually that good right now, you'll be able to identify when it does become good. The second reason, the theme of the set, is something that's happening a lot lately as the sets come more and more pre-built. So, for example, if you take food, right, Simic food as a deck in Thornfell Drain, that was kind of a pre-built deck, right? If you just take every card that says food on it, you end up with a deck, right? And the only way to find that out is to try the deck. Stuff like Mardu Knights, right? There was a Mardu Knights deck. It came pre-built, but it turned out that it wasn't as good as Simic food. Decks like, Cycling. Cycling is a pre-built deck, right? It's clear to anyone that looks at the card file that there is going to be a Cycling deck. There's just a question of whether the deck is going to be good or not. So you have to try it out, right? And that's something that's been happening more and more with the newest sets. Adventures is also a good example, right? Edgewell Innkeeper and Lucky Clover just are begging to be paired with adventure cards. So this is a deck that, again, comes sort of pre-built, which isn't a demerit to whoever built the deck originally, right? There were different ways to build it, but the idea of building an adventure deck is something that just came with the set, right? So you should just take it and see if it's good or not. And again, here, I like pushing to the max first. So, for example, my Mardu Knights deck is going to have a bunch of Knights, right? I'm going to try to play as much of a Knighty deck as I can, and that doesn't always pay off. For example, with Rogues. When Rogues came out, Rogues was a pre-made deck, right? There were a bunch of Rogue Synergies cards that had Rogues in them, and that said whenever you play a Rogue or whenever something happens with a Rogue, if you just put all those cards in the deck, your deck wasn't going to be very good, right? I tried that. I tried building Rogues decks that weren't as good as the Rogues versions that exist now. And that is because the way to build the deck was a little bit less all-in than I was building it. So it still had Rogue Synergies, but it was sort of a hybrid, Rogue control deck. But it's not how I operate most of the time. I just try to build the decks to the best of their ability. I try to push them to the max. And most of the time, I found that it works. And sometimes it doesn't, but it still gives me a good idea of whether the theme is worth exploring or not. In Forgotten Realms, there are 3 different set mechanics. The first one is dungeons, venture into the dungeon. I don't think that mechanic is very good. I've tried looking at decks and seeing, what they look like. I haven't played with them that much yet in Constructed, but it looks like a limited mechanic to me. I will try to build venture into the dungeon decks for Constructed, but I don't expect them to be good. The second one is rolling dice, right? And there are a couple of synergies there, and that's basically the same thing. I don't expect it really to be a thing in Constructed. So these two are kind of out. And then there's the third one, which is treasures, which is the one that has potential Constructed applications, right? Because treasures let you cheat on mana, and we've already established that that is a very strong thing. Right, so this doesn't mean that there will be a good treasures deck, but there are a bunch of cards that say treasure in the set, right? There's a card that, makes more treasures when you make a treasure. There's Zorn, I don't know how to say that, X-O-R-N. There are cards that gain bonuses if you cast them off treasures, right? There's a new Thoughtseize, so to speak, if you cast it off a treasure. So I'm going to be trying treasure decks because I think, that might be the set mechanic that works, right? So any card that says treasure in it is worth noting, right? Prosperous Innkeeper, for example, is a card that, it's has the potential to be much better than Wily Goblin was because there is now a treasure theme. So I'm not going to be building a dive rolling deck because I think that one is just too bad. I will build a venture into the dungeon deck or a couple, but I don't expect them to be good, and I'll give up very quickly. And then I'll try to push treasures to as much as I can, because that is the one set mechanic that looks potentially very good. Even though, it might just be bad, but I think this is something that I want to find out for myself. And finally, there are the cards that improve existing decks. And this can be done in two ways. The first way is just, this is a better card for this deck, right? It's going to improve it a little bit. For example, imagine you're playing Mono Red and they release a new Tor brand, except it's a 3/4, right? Instead of a 2/4, but it does the exact same thing. That's an improvement, right? That is a card that is going to make your Mono Red deck slightly better. It's not going to change anything meaningful, right? It's not going to change how it operates. It's not going to solve any problems that you had, right? But it is going to make your deck better. And then that's also worth noting. But it usually doesn't shake the meta game up too much, right? When a deck gets a little bit better, a small improvement, but it's not fixing any problems, that is not enough to push the deck into, a tier above what it previously has. But if it comes up with other things, then it can be, right? If you're just adding this stuff up. So if they released, a slightly better Torbrand, but also a slightly better Frostbite, and a slightly better Faceless Haven, right? Then maybe that's enough to push Mono Red ahead of where it was. But sometimes there's a new card that solves a problem that existed before, and that's when you have to pay attention to it. For example, Burning Hands. Burning Hands is my pick for potentially the most influential card in the set early on, because it's solving a problem that has plagued red decks, since for many years at this point, which was killing Lustrous Beast and Elder Gargoth. Right, so if I'm playing Mono Red, or if I'm playing Izzet Dragons, for example, I have real trouble with the big green creatures. If I'm playing Izzet Dragons, I lose to Lustrous Beast a lot, I lose to Elder Gargoth a lot, I lose to Coma a lot. And this card is a 2-mana card that kills all of them at its instant speed. That just didn't exist before. So this card is solving a problem for me. It's allowing my deck to do something that it didn't do before. So it's the same as, releasing a white counterspell. Right, if they released a literal counterspell but white, that would change a lot in how the white decks operate. It would open up a lot of possibilities. And I think Burning Hands is a card that does that. So this is the type of card that I think you should pay particular attention to, right? So do you, say for example, you're having trouble with Goldspan Dragon, right? Your deck loses to Goldspan Dragon a lot. And then they print a card that says, counter target Disdainful Stroke. They print Disdainful Stroke. All of a sudden, it's like, well, now I have a tool to solve a problem that existed before. So now my deck is potentially much better than it was. So this could mean that, the Izzet Dragons or Mono Red go from being tier 2 to being tier 1. And Izzet Dragons was already tier 1, I think, but, maybe it becomes the best deck. Because it is now capable of solving a problem that existed before. So when you're trying to slot a new card into an existing deck, you have to see if it's just a better version of something that existed before, which is a small upgrade, but it's unlikely to, change the format very much. Or if it's a card that lets you solve a problem that previously existed, like Burning Hands, right? And if it can solve a problem that previously existed, it has the chance to change the format, right? So it's similar to, how Emergent Ultimatum. What is the problem with Emergent Ultimatum? Well, you don't actually have enough cards to get that will win you the game, right? And you don't have enough playables that you can put in your deck that will make for a good Emergent Ultimatum pile. Well, now Auron's Epiphany and Valky are that. So they change how the deck operates fundamentally. They solve a problem that existed before, right? And then the deck went from being not a deck to being arguably the best deck in the format. So always pay attention to what the problems are with each of the decks. For example, Mono White. Mono White is a deck that is vulnerable to sweepers, for example. And then Elite Spellbinder really helps solving that problem, right? Elite Spellbinder, I think, made Mono White a better deck than it was before because it is helping with something concrete, right? It's not just a slightly better 3-drop than what you had before, right? It's not, a Maul of the Skyclaves that gives an extra toughness. It's not that. That would be good, but not that good. It's just a different type of effect that is solving a problem. So you need to know what the format looks like and why things are the way that they are, right? Why is this certain deck losing to the other deck? Well, it's Elder Gargoth, it's Lustrous Beast, it's Coma, right? So those are the problems. This new card helps solving them. So it's potentially very, very good. So that's how I usually approach the spoiler season and, the first weeks with the set. I try to identify these 3 types of cards, busted unique cards cards that work with the theme of the set, and cards that improve existing decks, particularly if they solve problems that existed before. So these are the things in that order that I check when a new set comes out. Obviously, this is not the only way to do it. These are not the only things you have to pay attention to, right? But your focus has to be somewhere. Like, you have to be looking for something. And this is what I look for. This is what has worked for me. So this is why I'm telling you, and maybe it will work for you as well. If you like this video, make sure to check out my Patreon page. It's patreon.com/PVDDR, and there you can support my work and get some extra perks on top of it, such as access to an exclusive Discord channel and early access to the videos. And special thank you to my biggest supporters: Adam Redsim, Adrian Camilleri, Daniel Luz, Foxy, Fernando Vizeu, Geoffrey Whitehead, Harlequin the King, Igor Petrov, Joey, Calvin Pang, Kevin Massey, Lawson, Mattia Giorgini, Richard Gurgis, Silvia Leticia, TJ Webb, Thomas Pokorny, and Dimitri. I really appreciate the support, and I'll see you next week.